I can't believe that we're already at this point where we're going to be talking about some more advanced kinds of technologies. But here we are. This is always, to me, kind of one of the cooler sections of treatment planning. And we're going to spend a couple weeks on this particular topic. So fret not that if it's something that you feel like you don't have a great grasp on clinically yet, you will. It's invariably something that people are going to spend a lot of time on in your treatment planning, clinicals, because we do a lot of IMRT nowadays. I also want to point out, so the materials for this week and future weeks will be posted ahead of time. So, for example, we had, I think this material I tried to get out Monday or Tuesday. So I will absolutely have the next couple of weeks. If you check on most likely Mondays, everything will be posted. The only thing I may not post yet are any kinds of quizzes or things like that. If I'm finalizing one or two questions on a homework, but you always have a week to get those in, so I'm less worried about that. But as far as the slides, any sort of text documents, things like that, I will have up for you guys earlier this quarter. So I hope that helps. If you get a chance to review it, great. If not, it won't feel different than the past. So okay, so let's get into it. Does anybody have any questions, or anybody want to vent their spleen about anything? Okay. We are down a student this quarter, and so it is difficult, I think, for all in some facet, but anytime there's struggles to get stuff understood or made as connections, transitioning into the clinic, please know that I want to make sure everybody is successful. So as much as I can, please feel free to ask questions early and often. Don't want to lose anybody else. And so I know a couple of people have asked about final exams. When will those be released? Because of any time that student does not make it through in terms of success in a course, there's a little bit of evaluation that gets done to make sure everything is copacetic. So that is occurring kind of in the background. So when that is completed, I'll open up the 321 final exam stuff. You obviously already have all your grades, but that way you can go back, and if you want to see how something was graded or whatnot, you'll have that info. If anybody has any specific questions or things that they recall, either on the oral exam or on the take-home or anything like that, feel free to reach out to me directly. But in the meantime, I appreciate your patience working through that. So let's get into this. So, and I will go ahead when I publish this recording, so I won't make you sit through the 10 minutes of dead air. So I'll clip the middle part, and so if you ever have to go back and listen, it won't be a total waste of your time. So let's talk about IMRT. So question for the room, who has done any sort of an IMRT plan before? If you have, okay. Yeah, I think, for the most part, if you have or you haven't, of it may very well change just as we kind of talk about all sorts of different techniques and things like that. But IMRT is especially kind of cool because this to me is that area where you get to apply a little bit of your art side to come up with an answer to a question that you yourself populate into an optimizer. So I've pulled up an example case here. This is an anonymized patient. And by the way, Chris, remind me to chat with you offline regarding some stuff. But in this particular case, this is just a very typical 45 gray prostate seminal vesicles, and it's going to correspond with the Journal Club article. So I'll take a little break about halfway through. We'll go over the Canvas side. But this week's Journal Club and the take-home kind of homework quiz thing are all based on prostate, and I think it's the most natural place to start when we talk about IMRT, because you guys are going to be doing some more advanced three-dimensional work. If you talk about six-field prostates, the first quarter you're going to do APPA and all that stuff, and you're kind of ready to move on. And so as we start to graduate into looking at some of the more common cases that we implement some advanced technologies with, prostate is by far one of the number one first run cases that most people will start with. So it would be my advice to you all to not start out with something like a head and neck or a brain or something more difficult. Live your dream if that's how you want to go. I will tell you though that throughout the years, I have in my own mind kind of come up with things that pretty much work in almost all cases. And those are things I'll be sharing with you over the next few weeks to hopefully expedite your learning so that you don't have to take years to get to that point. But what's neat about to me with IMRT is the end point. If you go back and pull up any one of your preceptors' cases, start thumbing through and looking through what got approved. That's always a great way to start. And what you'll notice is that if you then go, maybe you have a couple dosimetrists in your in the office that you work with, go pull up one of their cases. I'm willing, and correct me if I'm wrong, have you guys ever done this? Like, have you ever gone and looked up some of the dosimetrist stuff in the clinics and seen maybe how they've differed? Right? I mean, it's probably one of the most natural things to do. And what I think is especially kind of cool with IMRT is you'll find out that of the stuff that differs between how people do their IMRT planning, one of the most basic tenets is that, boy, these optimization algorithms are really good at kind of making things all kind of come out the same. And we'll talk about how to manipulate things, but we're going to look in when I kind of draw from inferences of clinical cases tonight. I'm not going to spend a ton of time, but I'm going to start with the basic stuff. Okay. So one of the things that I think is important to know is what's actually going on within this optimization. And really, first off, we have to know what the heck it is that IMRT actually does. So once upon a time, the physicist that I used to work with, I'm sure, well, maybe I haven't told you, but he was quite possibly one of the most brilliant individuals ever to walk the face of this earth. Sadly, he is no longer walking this earth, but he was the kind of physicist that, apart from just having an amazing personality and not like too physicsy, but he was the guy that like would be riding in his car, driving in his car. His son would call him up and ask him to calculate offsets based on gold marker positions in the head. It is actually someone other than, yes. And so what he was able to do while driving in traffic would be to calculate offsets of isocenter positions based on three-dimensional coordinate space in his head. So his office that he worked at was right near an apartment complex when I first moved to the Seattle area. So he loved it. He loved kind of dropping me off at my place because the whole way up I-5 through Seattle was like carpool lane. So he could, whenever he was late, he would always like, "Are you ready to go? Are you ready to go?" And so I'd hop in the car, and then he would get like 12 calls during the thing, and it was like an old school, right, like car phone, like attached to the center console kind of thing. So it wasn't like today. But yeah, on the speaker you'd hear these ISO coordinates, and then you'd hear the marker coordinates, and he would calculate these offsets to compare against what the computer calculated. I'm like, dear God, that's insane. But his whole thing, so I digress, right? If you don't know me yet, I digress. So his whole thing was IMRT stood for I'm really tired. And all his premise was that there was no case that could not be solved in a three-dimensional plan that IMRT could. And it wasn't that he wasn't willing to acknowledge that IMRT wasn't really good doing what it did, and it's very efficient nowadays doing what it did. But his belief was that 3D was superior to IMRT for a myriad of reasons. Mostly because you could QA the heck out of a 3D. Therapists could understand what you were treating with the 3D beam. Doctors could review blocks and things like that on the 3D field. You really can't do that with IMRT. Things that once made sense, like that were driven home in basic kind of therapy 101 stuff, no longer apply in this now. So under the umbrella that we have of 3D planning, IMRT kind of falls under this. So when the question is asked, what is this? So we can kind of summarize it, say it's advanced 3D conformal treatment. Now the kicker is it utilizes non-uniform beam intensity. These are patterns that are created with non-uniform beam intensity to achieve either a uniform or at least concave or convex dose distribution around your target. So you have multiple beams coming from all sorts of directions, which even the principal things still sometimes apply in terms of your choice of what beam angles to choose, but really it doesn't matter a ton. So, but namely you have more beams with IMRT than compared to 3D. And these beams have the intensity pattern across the field is modulated so that each beam in and of itself is not uniformly delivered. Like if the beam stops after one field is delivered of a 7-field prostate, okay, the dose distribution is going to be horrible. Unlike in a 3D conformal where it's not going to look great, but at least it'll be typically a uniform distribution throughout. So you add up all of these non-uniform fields to get hopefully a uniform dose to the target. But oftentimes it's really not so much uniformity in dose that you'll see in your weekly journal club. 2D plans and 3D plans are far more uniform in dose distribution than IMRT. But none of those guys can shape the dose quite the same way. So there's this term that we talk about that has to do with degrees of freedom. And probably, I'm sure we've talked about this in various things where degrees of rotation, when you talk about, shifting left, right, amp, post, sup, inf, pitch, roll, and yaw, right? There's 6 degrees of freedom in which to screw up a patient's treatment, right? When you talk about 3D conformal, there's really only like 5 things you can deal with. Who can guess what things can we quote unquote optimize in a 3D plan? Who wants to guess? Energy, perfect. Yep. What else? Right, we might choose 6x, we might choose 18x. Field weighting, yep. How much dose are we going to come through for some of these fields? Beam angles, normalization, maybe for the whole plan. Yep, blocking shape. So no matter what, although blocking shape, the field shape might be somewhat limited, right? In other words, we would never intentionally, for a 4-field pelvis, we wouldn't normally block out the prostate, let's say, or block out the target volume. So certainly we optimize gantry angle. We do that all the time, right? We might angle the whole brain fields from being directly lateral to slightly angling so you stay off the lens. Or maybe the patient is rotated, right? Like, have you ever done it? It never matches like this shape, right? Like the patient never lines up exactly like that. So we have to kind of tweak things. We adjust things like beam weight. I think that Lee put down, so good call, right? If we're off to one side or we need the dose to come in from one side because maybe there's heterogeneity or something else to deal with, we might want to adjust things like, oh, do we add a wedge, right? Is there something in the path of the beam that we're going to manipulate? We might rotate the collimator. Seems like a good thing, because certainly if we're talking about any sort of EDW type of thing, then it stands to reason that we might have to rotate the collimator to achieve the wedge. We might then also look at beam energy, as was mentioned, I think, right out of the gate. Now, these are the top 5, okay? There are more, right? Because the 3 really relatable things that we deal with in 3D, right? The 3 directions that we come from, gantry, collimator, and couch, right? So, but most often people don't associate couch rotation as the top 5 things. If you asked a dosimetrist, what are the top 5 things you optimize in 3D planning? This was the answer. These were the top 5. So this is like Family Feud or whatever. We asked 100 people, top 5 answers on the board, ready, go. Now, when we talk about IMRT now, we don't typically worry, well, I know we don't worry about a wedge. We don't worry about beam energies. Collimator angle is a little tricky. So I probably, in hindsight, I put a dash line through here, gantry angle. I probably should put a dash line through here on collimator, and then I'll show you why. But gantry angle is somewhat variable because you can overcome some small differences in gantry angle. But what it introduces is one thing. In addition to these, 4 or 5 that we might think are carried over, the one thing we know it optimizes is beam weight. And then it introduces this thing called like fluence. Does anybody have they ever heard of term like beam fluence? Anybody had any idea what that means, what that term means? So do you remember how I described it? Oh, probably. So fluence is, in this particular case, it's all good. If I want to look at a 10 by 10 field, right? In a 3D plan, I have maybe some blocks, things like that. But other than that, it's just the dose making it through whatever is not blocked is constant until the monitor unit chamber shuts off the beam, right? So assuming I just have an open beam at 10 by 10, then through that 10 by 10 field, it's constant passing through that 10 by 10 for the duration of time that the beam is on. So the fluence through that open beam is uniform. Yes. So I usually describe this as, if you look at lanes of traffic, you could tell what I deal with a lot because I oftentimes will refer to almost everything to deal with traffic. But you ever seen those guys who are like on the overpass or whatever, and they have like their orange vests on and it looks like they're just counting cars in whatever lane? If you haven't seen that, you're lucky. If you have seen that, you probably live in a busy metropolitan area, because those traffic studies that are done are based on basically car fluence. So it is the amount of, in this particular example of a freeway, it is the number of cars that pass through a given time period. So influence for this 10 by 10, well, time is dictated by how long the machine is on based on how many MU you calculate. But now when we're going to take and we're going to modify that fluence, not just uniformly, we're not going to put like a block in one corner, or we're not going to put a wedge in. We're now going to take our MLC and just kind of sweep it across the field. Well, if we didn't know anything about how to move those MLCs, we just watched them move though, what we would know is one thing. We may not know what caused them to move or for how long did they stay in any one position. What we know is that the fluence pattern for that same 10 by 10 field is going to look different. So imagine if you were to put a film in and take a look at what the fluence might look like for that 10 by 10. If you can think back to, even like an imaging, what we would normally look at, just a plain image, just nothing in the path of just taking a film of a water tank, it would just be gray. But now you throw in somebody's chest and you get lung, you get bone. All of those densities adjust the fluence on the back end that are received by the imager that create the image. So your patient will also change the fluence. So anything that, we call this anything that kind of perturbates the beam, or anything that perturbs the beam from just being this nice uniform distribution, we call that something that's able to adjust the fluence. So anything can do it, but this fluence profile is what is optimized in IMRT. Okay, so this will have to be updated in the not too distant future, but the only thing I wanted to highlight here is no matter what your planning system is nowadays, it has these things. It has dose volume characteristics. It might have biological based functions depending on what version and all that good stuff. But no matter what, there's no planning system out there. So the lines were drawn through because IMRT doesn't optimize beam energies. It doesn't optimize wedges. So there are utilities or tools secondary to the optimization of the fluence that you can go through and tell the optimizer, hey, will you pick the best gantry angle for me? Or will you pick the best collimator angle for me? But that is secondary to, once it comes up with that, then you would start optimizing the dose. So really the things that the optimization software does is it optimizes the beam weight and the fluence profile. Is that everybody cool with that? Okay. So how in the world do we do this? So there's a myriad of ways that different planning systems might have for steps or ways to do these. But in the end, what you want to assign, let's put the rubber to the road here. I'm going to drift away from the slides so we can look at this a little bit more up close. So I have a patient that has a prostate and seminal vesicles that we're going to treat to 45 gray. Okay, so in this example, I want to deliver 4,500 centigray through a bunch of fields. All right. Has anybody here ever treated static beam IMRT? Okay. Hopefully you all have, but it's okay if you haven't. All right. So I just created a 9-beam IMRT plan. And what I'm going to do now, and I'm even going to turn off the visualization here so that you don't have to see all these crazy lines. What I am wanting to now tell the optimizer, I want to dictate now what it is I want it to give me. So if my prescription is 45 gray and I have a PTV, it makes good sense that I should have a criteria in here that says, hey, for that thing called the PTV, I want to give a minimum dose of 4,500. Everybody follow. So I'm going to tell the optimizer whatever it is I want to get. So in truth, there's a myriad of ways of doing this, but in truth, even inverse plan is based on forward planned IMRT principles, where the optimizer doesn't inherently know that for this particular case, this is what I want. I have to still tell it. With any sort of objective that I'm assigning, this is called an objective function or optimization function. Any sort of thing I put in is going to be attached to whatever the type of structure it is. So in other words, for things like the rectum, I don't have as many options, right? Which should make sense. In other words, I wouldn't want to have a label of something called rectum that is a organ at risk and accidentally assign it a minimum dose, right? Not all planning systems, though, currently have that functionality, so I'm going to put the caveat out there. Here's what I will tell you. No matter what, my belief is that when you start running IMRT plans, there are 2 reasons why things go awry real quick. One is the volumes that you are telling it to either treat or avoid. There's some conflict with that. Or you did something kind of bonehead where you assigned a minimum dose or a mean dose or something like that to some structure that you really didn't mean to. You meant to set max dose. So there's something in the optimization objectives that isn't making sense, okay? But all I'm going to tell the system now is that the minimum dose is 4,500. Now I come over here and I say objective or constraint. Does anybody know what the difference is between an objective and a constraint? Treat the objective, avoid the constraint. Okay. Anybody else? So perfect. Learning is going to happen. So if I tell you the objective is this dose, then that tells the optimizer, hey, it would be great if the minimum dose to this structure, almost, it would be great if this structure that I've identified had a minimum dose of 4,500 centigrade. And I come down here and I say, well, notice how when I just selected it, it defaults to objectives. Okay. So you say, well, that's kind of weird. Like, when would I ever choose a constraint, or what does that mean? So let's just work with the default. The default is an objective and it gives me a weight. What do you think weight means in the context of what it is I have asked for here? I've said, hey, this structure called the combined PTV, I want a minimum dose. Yep, priority. Perfect. Now, does it tell you what 1 means? No. So there are differences in planning system algorithms that look at these things differently. For those of you who use Eclipse, this is RayStation is a little bit closer to how things work in Eclipse, but not exactly. For Pinnacle, it doesn't really work out the same. So what I type in here, I don't care if you don't have to memorize this. I'm going to put in a value of 80. It doesn't matter at this point in time, because all this says, I could leave it at 1 and just scale everything else down. Does that make sense? I'm just defining the starting point around which everything else is going to be related. Does that make sense? So an objective looks at the weight and says, okay, the starting point of 80. Now, depending on what I put in here, in addition to that, is going to be attached to whatever the dose limits I put in, but also what weight I give relative to what I just told it I want to get the dose in at a weight of 80. So what are the 2 main dose limiting structures for prostate cancer? Perfect. Bladder, rectum, femurs. What about bowel? No, no. So in this, I will tell you, do you guys, so when you're talking about just prostate or just prostate seminal vesicles, typically I will tell you that the bowel space is not involved. So if you worry though about doing nodal coverage, if you're going to be treating up to, like L4, L5 to cover the nodes, now that's a different ballgame. Okay. So right now, there's nothing in this that there's no relative value for it to know. So prescription of 4,500. What would you guys accept as a hot spot, as a max dose for a prescription of 45 gray? $48, okay. $49. So in this example, 110, okay. So in this example, It just, if I left this with one, right? This is exactly right. $1. Price is Right. Showcase Showdown. All right. So under 10%. Okay. So in this one line item that says I want the minimum dose to be 4,500, if I say start, if I start optimizing those 9 beams, it should have no problems. Correct me if I'm wrong, but follow the logic. It should have no problems delivering 45 gray to this volume. Is that a fairly true statement? Right? Totally. Because there's no penalty for giving me 10,000, right? The only thing I've told it, hey, I just want you to get at least 4,500. So 7,000 gives me 4,500. 9,000 gives me 4,500. But that's not good. So the one thing you have to change in your mind between 3D and IMRT is these planning systems will take every blessed shortcut you allow it as the planner. If you don't want dose to go somewhere, you have to tell it. If you don't want it to get hot, guess what? You have to tell it. It's not going to think for you. So know what you want up front. This is the forward planning part. So, all right, we'll come back to that. So inverse planning starts with me telling the system what my desired dose distribution looks like. In fact, really, what I'm doing is if you think about it, really what I want to tell the system is draw me a DBH that looks like this. It comes right to 4,500 and drops straight down, right? And then everything else in the perfect world, every other critical structure, every other square voxel around this gets no dose. Comes right here, right? Everywhere in between of those two things is a trade-off. So what you're going to tell the system to do is you're going to almost build the DBH that you want and let it try to come up with it. So the steps that you go into do this are you come up with you are building what's called a score function by adding in those objectives. So with every objective you add, you're telling the optimizer what it has to do. So now, after that, the computer will take those values, internalize it into code, and try to come up with a solution to that. The difference between inverse planning and forward planning is when you guys do your breast tangents now, or you guys do your whole brain, or you do 4-field pelvis, or when you get doing 6-field pelvises and stuff, the difference is you're going to run your plan, you're going to look at it, and you're going to say, oh, I need to do this. Or, oh, I didn't get that here, so what do I need to do with my block? It's a lot of back and forth. So the difference is we're going to define everything up front, which is kind of forward planish, but we're going to let the system then come up with some of the more important stuff. So forward planning, you come up with the beam parameters, you do the dose calculation, you look at the dose distribution, and the dose delivery is essentially done with uniform radiation intensity, right, with those standard fields. Inverse planning is you're going to tell it what those DBH goals are. What is the objective function? You define that up front, then you optimize. The optimizer is what takes the goals that you give it and converts it into a fluence map. A fluence map in and of itself is not deliverable. What comes out of the optimizer is nothing other than, through each beam, what the fluence map should look like. We then have to take that and generate an MLC pattern or a sequence of steps of the MLCs to create that. In the end, what you wind up with, therefore, is dose delivery through non-uniform radiation intensity. Is this what physics measures during? Absolutely. So when your physicist runs what's called, some people use map check, some people use arc check, some people use, well, there's a whole myriad of things, delta 4, all of those things, they are measuring the leaf sequence patterns against a predefined fluence map that the planning system generates. Kind of cool. So the whole basis for this came, look how long ago this is, right? This is a long time, almost 40 years ago. This guy, Brahm, and actually in 1981, there were people that was doing this in, oh, don't even get me started, Kelly. That people who did 1981, they were doing this for pi meson therapy. So what they've found back in the early 80s is that, hey, if you just deliver a uniform dose, right? If you really wanted to create a uniform dose around, let's say, a chord. So I want no dose in the middle and I want uniform dose all the way around. The only way to do that would be to point a whole bunch of beams going around in a circle and constantly blocking off half the beam and creating some sort of like metal compensator that made the fluence pattern do this to the dose. So that from this direction, obviously this is like a half beam, right? So all the way down, it would constantly shield less and less. So you get the higher dose all the way around, and then it would rotate around and do that. And sure stuff, that's what you would get. So this magic bullet that it does is in the pre-IMRT days, where you guys are in clinic right now, you're in pre-IMRT, right? So hopefully the best you could shoot for, if you're going to do this, prostate, and again, this illustration purposes only. If you have a prostate that looks like this, I suggest you see your healthcare provider. Your prostate is essentially, it's creating this convex target around the rectum. So in pre-IMRT, you would have no ability to do anything but create this 4-field box or even 6 fields, but you're always going to be irradiating all the way through on the laterals and the ant and post. So you will get the shape of all the intersecting fields. So if we want to go to an IMRT situation, the cool part about IMRT is now we can sculpt the dose off of the rectum. We can tell the optimizer now, create a non-uniform fluence to get the dose off of that area we don't want it to get onto. That creates this sort of a distribution. Then you couple it with image guidance, and this is what we get. The problem is, and I know I've said this before, IGRT didn't come in the right order. People were doing IMRT before they did IGRT, and the problem was they were doing this to their IMRTs before we could image it. So there are advantages. Conformality of the high dose area is an advantage to IMRT. You can get concave shaped dose distributions. You can decrease your penumbra because you're shielding a lot of the beam. You spare all these normal tissues because you can assign a very sharp dose fall off. If you can lessen the dose to the target, to the organs at risk, you should be able to, if you were fine with giving 50% of the rectum 50 gray, now you only get 10% of the rectum getting 50 gray. It stands to reason, well, then fine, I'll just keep pushing up the dose until I get the same 50% at 50 gray. That's totally logical. The goal being, of course, to the payers, we would tell people, oh, well, complication rates should be less, therefore reduce costs. Because in essence, what you're doing is you're delivering these bunch of small simultaneous treatments all throughout the target. Now, there are biological advantages too. Some work with you, some work against you, depending on what you're looking at. But we know that there's a sharp dose fall off at the PTV boundary. So when I come in here and I say, here's my thing, I've got combined PTV minimum dose. You guys said you wanted less than, say, 10%. So I'm going to say a max dose 49.50. Let's say 49. How important is it to get the minimum dose to the target compared to not getting too hot? Do you understand the question? So what's more important? Not going above 4,900 or not getting 45 gray in? Ha. Dose. That's less. Oh. So do you guys know the Hippocratic Oath? You heard of it, at least? Do you know what the first statement is? First, do no harm. So does that change your answer? Yeah, that's the $1,000,000 answer. You don't decide that. It's the doctor's call. Now, I realize that that is a pie in the sky kind of vantage point because I don't know about you, my doctors aren't going to walk back and type in a number here. If you have ones that do that, good on you. You still need to know what these mean. But for the sake of the argument, let's just say your physicians don't do that. So now it circles back to you all pretty much universally said it was most important to get the dose in than it is to get the max dose down. That is a fair characterization of your answers? More important to get the dose there than it was to keep the maximum dose down. Everybody cool with that? Oh, good. Totally agreed. Totally agreed. And let's be honest. What's reasonable, you should just put in quotes, right? Because you'll run plans in your career that you think is great. Perfect. Right on cue. You think is great, and the doctor is going to want something changed that makes it less good in your eyes. Don't get your What was the phrase I heard? I don't screw it up, but don't get too worked up over it. Yes, I did. So in this scenario, this is the point where the rubber meets the road. If you're just starting out doing these, dear God, cover the volume first. Okay. Show the doctor what it will take to cover the volume. They then come back and say, oh, okay, I see what you did. Do you really, I notice it's spilling out over here or over here. Can you back that off? So the first iteration, cover the volume. So here's the take home. If my minimum dose of 4,500 is weighted 80, and then the max dose isn't as important if it's in the target. Well, here's the thing. Here's my only answer to that. At a dose of 45 gray, in this case, probably not. But the easiest retort to that is if the doctor wanted 50 gray to the target, they would have written for 50 gray. So there's a balance between, yes, the max dose is probably okay if it's in the GTV or something, but there's a fine line. Does that make sense? So if I weighted this thing 80, now relative to 80, how important is it that the max dose be less than 4,900 in your guys' mind? I mean, dare to dream. Sure. Yeah, 1 through 80. Yep. Okay, 70. Some people say 60, 75. So the closer it is to 80, the more balanced. Runs off to ask the doctor. How about this? How about we set it at half of what this is? Okay. And let's just see what happens. Here's the great part. There's no right or wrong answer here, because no matter what, the system is going to show you what it is you've asked for in its own way. Does that kind of make sense? So you can't screw this up, save for one thing. And we talked only briefly about these differences between objective and constraints. In optimization speak, an objective is a goal, a constraint is a must. An objective is a goal in optimization space. A constraint is a hard lockdown must-have. Example, 45 gray to the cord. If you have a physician that will not ever, 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 ever allow more than 45 gray to the cord, it's a reasonable option to put a constraint at 45 gray. A constraint locks down the optimizer. It will do, this is the first do no harm constraint that the optimizer knows. In my clinical career, I could probably count on mine and my kids' hands how many times I've used constraints. In my clinical life, it is almost universally true that objectives do two things really well. One, they will get you where you want to go if you ask for it the right way. Two, when you plug in something and say it's a constraint, optimization speed drastically reduces. This is treated, imagine normal weights might range from 1 to say 200, 250. A constraint you could see as being like 9.99 times 10 to the 99th weight, right? Just something ridiculous. So here's my litmus test for objectives. You should not start optimization. You can't start it until you at least have a min dose or a mean dose or some target identified. And you should always have the upper limit, the bound which it can go through. I strongly suggest before you ever click start to run this, you go back through and just ask yourself, if this, can this exist by itself? If you find a conflict, don't expect the optimizer to fix it for you. How do you do that? Well, we'll have to talk about that over the next couple of weeks. But if I ask for a min dose of 45 gray, can I coincide that with a max dose of 4900? Are those two simpatico? That's Russian for, are those two compatible? They're not. In what way? So my max is 4900. Maybe I misspoke. Your min is 4500. But that is correct. You are 1000% correct. And the optimizer is smart enough to tell you that when you go to do that. Well, trust me, that's all good. And there's any number of bonehead things that I have done like this, and I'll say, oh, yep. And you don't realize it until you start to run it and it says, nice try. Not going to let you do that. Okay. There are different kinds of IMRT methods. There is step and shoot. Have you all heard of step and shoot? You could think of this as also field and field, right? Has anybody ever heard of the term sliding window? Perfect. What is the difference between those two? So which one takes longer to treat, segmental or dynamic? Takes longer to treat. Good job. It's all good. Let me ask you this. Which one has more typically higher monitor units? A plan run with segmental MLC or dynamic? Yep. Segmental is slower because what happens is there is a beam hold that is inserted after each control point that is created from the optimizer. The beam hold is inserted and the leaves move to their next position. And then the beam turns on and they get a couple MU out and then the leaves, so the beam hold stops the beam and the leaves go to the next position. Dynamic, by contrast, starts at one side of the field and then just slowly moves the leaves across, which is great. And we'll see that next week, kind of how that looks. But because these are narrow little slits of opening, the MU tends to be higher because it takes more MU to get the dose through where it needs to. So IMAT, people, the correct term is IMAT. Nobody calls it that. What do we know this as? Anybody know? VMAT. Yeah. So please don't be fooled, though. If you see IMAT, you just need to, in your mind's eye, recall that oh, that's the same. And then you get into tomotherapy, which I'm not going to talk about tonight. So Astro came out with some recommendations to keep us rogue clinical folks from going crazy and doing everybody with IMRT. They outlined times where you should employ IMRT. If you have an irregular target, here's stupid question number 5,000. Is there ever a target that's not inherently irregular? I don't know many circular, evenly displaced tumors. Close proximity to critical structures, right? You could check off these two right away. Everything you treat, because this is close proximity, that's very legalish, right? Like lawyers could say, well, close is like within a mile. So yes. IMRT is the only option to cover the volume with narrow margins to protect adjacent structures. Really, the recommendation is to prevent grade 3 toxicities or higher, because one of the auto approval things for IMRT is if you have previously treated this area or close to it, IMRT is almost the de facto approval. It's understood that this is the way you're going to avoid areas that you have to because you've previously treated. Or you need to conform the dose around those concave targets. So I want to make sure that you guys have a handle on the terms. These are all things you need to know. A beamlet. What are beamlets? They're pixels or rays. These are the small little intensity elements that make up the dose in the fluence map. I even put in here, see fluence map. Notice that when I was adding these, I didn't think it all the way through. They're not in any sort of order. Once upon a time, I'm sure I thought about doing alphabetical. Right, I like that. DMLC, dynamic MLC, continuously move the MLCs, shape the beam intensity while the radiation is on. High spatial resolution, higher spatial resolution with dynamic MLC than segmented. Quicker treatment time, higher MU. SMLC, delivery mode which leaves only move when the radiation beam is turned off and go to predefined positions for a prescribed number of monitor units. Each one of these steps, these leaf positions, is called, and even within dynamic, there is an actual leaf position. Those are called segments or control points, depending on the lingo that your planning system employs. Segments is the correct term, but control points are often what are used just in lingo. So this is important because each one of the control points has a uniform beam intensity. It is the basic unit of this, and truly in this, but the difficulty with dynamic is it doesn't stay in one position, but you could stop the beam at any time during a dynamic delivery and see one position. So they're related. Score. What's the score? Well, Virginia won the other night, so that was kind of cool. Score is when you add in all your criteria for the objectives. A figure of merit is just kind of like, well, it's a score. It's a numerical value indicating the optimizer's ability to solve your stated criteria problem. In the perfect world, you need to know, well, not the perfect world you need to know, but in the perfect world, comma, and what you need to know, comma, is that the ideal score is 0. So think of this as strokes over par as we're heading into Masters Week. 0 means it did not deviate. So a way to remember this, if your score, your overall plan figure of merit, if the score, the optimization function says 0, that means it did not deviate from what you asked it to do. It solved it easily. The more things you add, therefore, for it to work through, you'll find very quickly it's never going to get to 0. Forward planning, it's what we all do. And there are elements, in the purest sense, there are elements of forward planning in inverse planning, as we've already kind of seen. But it's just the trial and error that we talk about. Inverse planning is we're going to define up front what we want, and it's then going to internally come up with an optimization pattern that is converted into a deliverable MLC intensity pattern that we can treat with to get the desired dose distribution. Class solution. Has everybody ever heard of what a class solution is before? Has anybody ever heard that term? Okay. So we will look at these as well. Class solutions are, and this is stuff that, if you're at a place that has, been doing these for a long time, they may have class solutions where just based on the experience of solving kind of similar cases, this particular way of doing it always works. So a class solution, you could almost script. You could say, these beams at these angles with this stuff going on, this is what we get, and this is what our docs like. So it becomes kind of scriptable. Like you do this every time. Iterations. That term, it just says, how many times is the optimizer going to try to achieve your goals? Like an objective, as we said, the idealized situation, but it's the objective is what we're telling the system we want you to really, really try to do. A constraint is not a really, really want you to do, it's you will do. Like me saying, you will do your homework. That's a constraint. It's a must-have. It results in slower optimization and, quite ironically, not very often what you really want. And I have examples of how that looks. It's crazy, by the way. Solution space. This is akin to degrees of freedom, but what we allow the optimizer to work with. So the amount of room we give the optimization engine to get to the goal function score of 0. So the more things we offer it, and when I say it, the optimizer, the engine, the more beams, the more different projections, different energies, what have you, the more variables you supply, the larger the solution space. The larger the solution space, the better your chances of getting a score to its ideal state of 0. Fluence pattern or fluence map, these are interchangeable. It's just the map of dose on a plane perpendicular to the beam axis, showing the irregular planned deposition of dose. This is what your physics, if you're familiar, why are constraints offered if they are so difficult to work with? Well, it's not that they're difficult to work with per se. You will use it. Like I said, there are times when you have the classic example is previously treated patients come back. That's when I've used constraints before. You can't deliver X, Y, or Z dose to this area, period, end of story. They will sacrifice all plan quality to not overdose this point. The easiest way to do that is to apply a constraint to that region. But the consequence of doing that is on the user side, it's difficult. But there are tricks, I'll show you what I know of or have heard throughout the years of how to employ these so that if you ever have to, it will be made easier. This fluence pattern or fluence maps are what your physics check, right? I think somebody had mentioned before. So there are fundamental issues, right? You have to draw the target. Hey, if I want to know what to treat here, it seems reasonable that that target's been defined for me. What about overlapping structures? Well, that's a problem. Are there any overlapping structures here? Well, here's my PTV. Let's turn off. At what point overlapping structures are anytime you are going to, would it be reasonable, in other words, if you're going to do IMRT and you guys already listed like the 2 or 3 only critical structures in this part of the body, it seems reasonable to have an objective function attached to each one of those things. Everybody follow? So in other words, I'm going to come in here right now. Bow. There you go. There you go. Let's let this. Segments. What did we say segments were? Now see, y'all are just, now you're getting into it. Love it. But no, Lee, segments are not penile bulbs. What are segments? Control points. Good. What number, if I have 9 beams, what reasonable number is there per field or total for 9 fields, would you say? How many control points should we allow this to use? And sadly, we can't define this per beam. We only can tell it the total amount that it can use. So it will decide for us. 270. Ooh, that's a variable. Any other? Big range. 30 per beam. Yeah, so 30 times 9 is 270. There you go. The 250. Have you all treated these? Have you guys been on the machine and treated these? How quick were they? Right? If I told you that every time, okay, perfect. So if I told you every time you have a control point, the beam has to stop and go to the next position. So 137 could be true if it's dynamic. How about this? How about we say start with 400 and work down? We could. How about, well, why don't we? But 400 is just really, oh. Let's do 300. So I will tell you, under normal circumstances, my advice to you, if you are doing segmented delivery, try to keep it at 20 control points per beam or less. Okay? Now this seems like it's kind of weird. Yeah. Anyway. It's gonna, I didn't see that. So minimum segment area. What the heck? What is that? What is that asking? All perfect. Okay. Yeah. We're going to have to tell the optimizer, how small can you make any one of these control points? This is kind of lame, I'll tell you. Imagine this. I have a 15 by 15 field. I didn't say, or I can't tell the system, every opening that you have has to have at least 4 centimeters in area. Because what it will actually do is it'll open up a section in the upper corner, then one in the lower corner, and these might be narrow little slits. They all add up to 4 centimeters total, but that's kind of not really what we're talking about, right? In general, people will say, even in radiation therapy 101, what's the smallest field anybody would be willing to treat with? That's the fundamental question. So let me ask you guys, what's the smallest field you guys would be willing to treat with? 4 by 4, 2 by 2. Dear God, Shelby's going to screw us all up. How about 2 by 2? 2 times 2 is 4, right? It's all good. So notice how this defaulted to the number of 4. Somebody must have wanted that. I'm guessing physics probably did that. So I'm not saying you don't touch this. I'm just saying know what it is you're telling it, you're allowing it to do. This is a big deal to me. This is a big deal. Minimum segment MU per fraction, which is really kind of not even necessary. How many monitor units should be passed through these control points? Your optimizer would love to have really low minimum MU. Your optimizer can show you the dose from fractions of a monitor unit. Do not kid yourself. Go ask your physicist this week or next week or whatever, but ask your physicist. This will be your second part of your participation. This is not rapid arc. No, we're not doing arc yet. Just straight, yeah, fixed beam. Ask your physicist what the minimum segment MU is allowed on an IMRT field. What's the minimum allowed? And then ask them why. Why is it not 1/2 of that? You guys email me back because I will post the answers next week because I guarantee they're going to be different. And it's kind of fascinating. So you do not have instantaneous output from your machine. When you're in the middle of an IMRT field and there's a beam hold, you do not have instantaneous dose. It has to ramp up in a sense again. So this is like torque on an electric car versus a gas car, right? Like on an engine that's powered by a battery, the torque at the wheels is instant. You push, you go. Teslas are fast, but they're instantly, all the power is ready to go. Gas engines, depending on your car, you hit it, it's going to be a slow kind of gradual power being supplied to the wheels. Don't know if you're in your cars or you like that stuff, but that's what I've got. So you don't have instantaneous dose when the beam comes back on in a control point. So you have to allow enough MU to actually get something that you are going to see on this pretty picture here, what you are telling it you want to get. Because if I leave this at like 0.5, it will show me a beautiful planet with 0.5 MU scattered all over the place. They go to QA it, it's going to look terrible. Just so you know. I'm going to leave the rest as defaults. So really everything in here I really left as a default except for the maximum number of segments. Okay. Now, beams. So I have all these beams. I have angles going all the way around. I'm going to tell it that not only do I want to tell the optimizer what options it has, I'm going to tell it per beam what options it has. Why on earth would I want to do that? Well, Can you ever think of a time when you wouldn't want the optimizer to define, let's say, the field size? Can anybody think of a time where you wouldn't want to allow the computer to come up with the field size? It's a good guess. Okay. Right. The easiest answer is anytime you don't want it to, right? But in essence, there are still places out there that still treat superclav with just a static AP field on a head and neck. There are people that will do a standard SCF PAB field on a chest wall or on a breast case and do IMRT for the lower parts. So in those cases, we may not want the system to automatically assign the field size. We may want to assign limits in whichever direction we want them to. So you have a myriad of things that you can choose here. I will tell you right now, this should just be a default off. A split field. We're not going to talk too much about the mechanics of this delivery, but has anybody ever treated fields that split? So it's like you leave the gantry at the one position, you treat one half of the field, and then it stops and you treat the other half of the field. Okay, you want to talk about long treatment times? Those are long, right? Just my personal opinion, uncheck those. Do not let things split. There are ways to not have to do split fields nowadays. Yeah, and that to me is not okay. If you think the person's going to be set up like this for that length of time, you're out of your mind, right? So we are going to let the system, like the whole point of optimizing is so it can come up with the shapes of the field. Like to take this off would be kind of pointless. Like then you're just running it to optimize the weights. Oh, but that would be kind of cool, right? Your 3D plans, here's a trick. Your 3D plans, you can use optimization tools by selecting something akin to, and all planning systems have this, they either have what's called beam weight optimization or segment weight optimization. But you can take your 3D, your 4-field box plan, punch it over into the optimizer, set some criteria. Once you get really good at establishing your dose criteria that you want, the coverage that you want, and don't allow it to change your fields, right? You've already got those defined, so you uncheck the box that says, oh, go ahead and have at it. Just optimize the MU, and it calls it segment MU, but in a 3D case, every beam would just have one segment. What that will do will just be to wait, if you have control points, like in a breast case, you could run this, or you could do the whole beam in and of itself. So these tools that we're talking about now, you could kind of cheat and use for 3D. Okay. So we've set up some parameters, 2 basic ones. We've said I want a minimum dose of 4,500, a max dose of 4,900. Let's just see. Oh, hang on. Because when I brought this patient anonymized over, I didn't do that. Yes. That's how you know I didn't prepare up front, because I wanted to build this with you guys. That's how much I care about you. All right, it's not going to take long, but while it's doing, I wish it's the Ray Station thing. How do we deal with overlapping structures? We're going to have to deal with that. Every case has some element of this. How do you decide what beam angles? How many do you know where to go to and from where? How are you going to evaluate the plan yourself? And this is an important part of dosimetry in my eyes. If you worked your tail off for this and you have achieved the goals that were prescribed to you from the physician's perspective, sometimes you have to sell it to the doc. Like maybe you've run 4 or 5 different iterations yourself and they're asking you about what it looked like when you know you've already ran it that way and it didn't work. So you have to be able to sell it back to the MD. This is where, when we talk about, last week I mentioned you guys have a case study this quarter, right? So I will push in certain areas on your planning. You need to tell me why what you did is the best option. Seems reasonable. So target delineation, OAR structures, there are a myriad of tools out there. ICRU 83, that is the important document. You need to know that report, not that you need to really know the contents of it, but a common kind of question, board-like question, is which one of the following ICRU reports is responsible for prescribing, recording, reporting photon beam intensity modulated radiation therapy? And they'll have 42, 50, 62, 83. So guess what? The answer is 83. It specifically is dedicated to IMRT. It talks about prescriptions. It emphasizes very clearly the need to have a GTV, a CTV, and a PTV. And then it talks about some specific aspects that come into planning. So here are some tips and tricks I'm going to share with you this time. First off, if you're going to have overlapping structures, you better be darn sure that what you drew is accurate. Okay, does you no good, because your evaluation of it and the optimizer's understanding, it doesn't know where bladder is on the patient. So if you don't tell it it's bladder, it doesn't know it's there. But if it's really there, that's a problem. Anytime, this is a big deal, of course, it directly affects us, right? The target. I only put in criteria for the target. So if what the doctor drew wasn't correct, there's no way that I could be expected to know, like, that's their deal, right? Not mine. Okay, so we've only let this go a little bit. We've said, remember that score function, that term? It shows a composite score of 6.04 times 10 to the negative 6. That's pretty dang close to 0, right? In fact, it says it's 0 and the minimum dose of 45 gray. So if I come up to 45 gray, I should see that I have minimum coverage at 100%. So 45/20, I'm at 100%. So I guarantee at 45, I'm at 100%. So it met that. Where did it struggle? It struggled based on this max dose. As we said before, is that really critical? May not be. So we look, so with just 1 or 2 objectives, right? This is a relatively conformal plan. It's not great. Like, I wouldn't sell this to the doctor. And if it's hard to see, my apologies. So the 45 gray line is the orange. The combined CTV is this kind of pinkish hue. So what we notice right off the bat is any just initial subjective looks at the coverage compared to the volume. Any subjective assessment right off the bat with just one pass through on our plan. Orange is the prescription, pink is the volume. Rectum dose, okay? Yeah, perfectly, right? Like, it's fine that it follows this. This almost kind of looks like a 3D 6-field conformal, right? We adequately covered the volume, but we kind of over covered it, right? And we say to ourselves, well, that's weird. What was in our original statement to the machine that told it, hey, I don't want this? Did we tell the optimizer, I want you to keep the dose really tight around this? Did we do anything like that? If the answer is yes, then I would submit that we would then go back and look at the weight of it and say, if we had something in here that said, keep it really super conformal, then we need to probably bump up the weight of that criteria. But when I look at these two, all we asked for was a minimum dose and a maximum dose. That's it. I didn't say anything else about other structures. And by other structures, think of it this way. It's any voxel not overlapping something called combined PTV. In other words, to the optimizer, it doesn't care that this is bladder, this is rectum, these are femoral heads. It only knows right now which voxels are contained within this structure right here. Until you tell it that beyond that matters, it doesn't know. So the miss that we're going to find comes from a myriad of things. The fusion that the image sets to allow the doctor to draw, the inaccuracies in making a PTV, what have you. You need to recall what OARs are with respect to parallel and series. Parallel, parotids, ears, TMJs, duodenum, liver, GI. Series, spinal cord, brainstem, optic chiasm, nerves, lens, brain, eyes, mandible, temporal lobes. So what does that mean to you? Max doses to these, max DVHs typically to these. For these guys, we create what's called a PRV, which I know I've talked about before. This is your PTV for your OAR. For serial structures, you do need to have a PRV. The expansion of which typically ranges from about 3 to 5 millimeters, just like your PTV. And it kind of makes sense, right? The ability for you to go through and establish your volume as being, if you're going to say, hey, this structure here called the prostate is going to move anywhere inside of this pink volume, along with the seminal vesicles, but at no time is the rectum ever going to move. Like that, really? Like that's not how that works, right? Like we all know that, right? Okay. So I want to tell the system, hey, I see what you did and I appreciate it, but I don't want this. Your optimizer only knows volumes. It only speaks the language of DVH. What does the V stand for in DVH? That's right, volumes. So if you want the dose off of anything, you have to tell it by virtue of creating a volume objective. So how do we do this? There is a number of ways. I will tell you what I do. Now, for those of you who all uses Eclipse in the treatment planning side, remind me again. Okay. So there is a feature in Eclipse, as there is in RayStation, that has to do with this dose fall off function within the body. And so a body or external contour is assigned with a dose level. Well, before I go too far down the road, by the way, first off, are you guys all doing okay? Okay. I wanted to do this earlier. So this week, by the way, class recording, I will post under here when we're done. This PowerPoint is really, truthfully, week 2 and week 3. So I'm going to stop the PowerPointing at the point of this, because we're going to finish up this planning thing. So I will just resume this next week. You have a journal club this week. There is a research article. Again, this is 20 years old, guys. It's IMRT's been around for so long, but where you guys are at, we're going to have to dig deep into the annals of research. But this was a paper that came out of MD Anderson comparing 2D, 3D, and IMRT. And I just have 9-10 questions for you on that paper. Your homework quiz this week is a take-home. It is based on the RTOG protocol 0415, which is a prostate protocol, and there are questions that are associated with this document. So in terms of like how you do things, these two are almost identical in their format. So next week, I need return to me their journal club document and the quiz homework document for this RTOG piece. There are 2 online presentations. Okay, paired those back. These are not terribly long. You have your pre-class quiz, which you've all taken. So you will take it. I would do that after you do everything and maybe re-listen to the recording tonight, Live Your Dream, but then retake the quiz and see how it goes. So that's what's on the slate. So you have your additional piece that we talked about. You're going to go talk to your physicist and find out what the minimum MU per segment is and why. Why is it not 1/2 of what it is? You have your journal club and your homework quiz. It's just based on the relative documents. I think you'll get a lot from those. Okay, so back to the show here. First off, is everybody clear on what is expected for next week? If I did not make that clear, please let me know. Okay. So in the final waning moments here, what I want to talk about is in Eclipse, you have this function. It's a dose fall off function that we use to assign for the body, for the external part of the patient, which is the entire patient. You can tell the system, hey, at some point away from my target, I want the dose to fall off to a certain level over a certain distance. And that's really pretty cool. Here's the problem with it. And it's the same problem that we have, in my opinion, that we have in RayStation or anything that does that feature. And here's why. In optimization space, let's just quickly add so you guys can see what this looks like. This is called a dose fall off. So what we're going to tell it is anything, right? Think about how this lives. Anything in this thing called external, any voxel that's contained, which is anything in the patient, right? So what's the high dose level? Well, in other words, what's the dose that I'm getting, or I'm trying to deliver here? It should be no higher than 4,500, right? 4,500 is my prescription. So you always start it with your prescription. Now, this is planning system specific, but if you follow the logic, you can create this on your own. You don't have to have the planning system do this for you. What are we willing, what do we want to see in terms of how quickly do we want the dose to fall off? Well, in the absence of having any knowledge of what it is, I'll just tell you a good starting point is half the dose. So we're going to say the high dose level at some point in this patient is the prescription. The low dose level is 2250. Now where we, and it really doesn't matter what we put in as the level, this is where the catch is. How far away are you willing to accept this dose from this dose? In other words, what distance are you willing to let the system drop the dose from 4,500 to 2,250? Well, the lower the number, let's do this. Let's see it. 1 centimeter, okay? I told the system now, take everything you did. I like what you're doing, but I want you to do something more. And that is, I want you to lower the dose now at a distance of 1 centimeter away from my target. I want you to deliver a dose that is 1/2 that dose. So it's already through 40 iterations. It's calculating all the beams. Because it's really fast, we'll go one more time. So these are iterations, right? The number of times the optimizer is going to try to find the ideal value. Notice how this value drops with each iteration. So we're locked in at, some value, 0052. So let's run it one more time. We want to see this number drop more. This is the goal. When it doesn't go any further, it's telling us that's as good as I can do. So we look now and we see where was it having a problem? Remember, originally it met this criteria of my minimum dose being 4,500, right? This was 0 before. Now, this was still a problem before. It was the max dose. Now we put in this dose fall off and we're saying, okay, well, that's even way higher than these guys. But what do we see in terms of conformality now? Better? Worse? Super. Here's the 5% hotspot I just turned on. Better. Let's go one step. Let's see what it looked like before we did this. So in other words, I want you to keep your eye on the prize here. I'm going to turn off the external contour. Just look at the DVHs of these guys and these guys. I want you to compare, just visually, there's not going to be a way to kind of do this side by side. It would be great if you could, but I'm going to undo the changes. and redo the changes. Do you see any meaningful things? Probably, right? Certainly we can see things like the rectal dose before, after. We do see, though, some element of loss of dose of the PTV, but then the question becomes better, but it could be, yeah. It's getting a lot narrower in its scope here. Okay. So I will tell you, though, here's the thing. If we look at, let's say our physician, they say, hey, for the PTV that we want, I want at least 95% of my volume to get 100% of the dose. That's how we do our thing. And we see that when we plug that in, 96.62% gets the dose. Here's the other part that they want. The CTVs. Do your doctors want coverage? Do you know? Do your doctors want coverage of both CTV and PTV, or just PTV? Does anybody have a sense on? So in other words, here's the danger. You could have 95, 96% coverage of your PTV, but that where it's 5% cold is right in the middle of the CTV, right? Like that wouldn't be great. So a way to kind of keep that balanced is to say, all right, I want to make sure, okay, so GTV, and some people call it GTV or CTV, and that's okay. That's nomenclature that really kind of has to come from the docs. So we use CTV. I mean, that's the correct way, but no. So the ability for us to say, I want 95% of my coverage of my PTV, but I don't want it to come at the expense of having the loss of, ideally I want 100% of this to get 45 gray. But I've probably put something in here that makes that harder to do. So what I want to make sure, though, is that at minimum, if it's not going to be 95 or 100%, I don't want it to come at the expense of shorting out my CTV or my GTV, right? So one of two things. Notice I didn't add objective functions for these, but I certainly could. If I saw, in other words, that this didn't work out. So this is telling me right now I have a green checkbox. It's telling me that 100% of this volume got 45 gray. You will absolutely run into cases where that's not the case. So in that situation, you will then come in and you'll say, so what does it look like? In other words, if I say I want, let's choose something I know I'm not going to make. At most 20%, 2,000. I don't think it was that good. It's not. So here's where you have a built-in real advantage. It typically doesn't take long to run a couple iterations. Then come back and look at whatever criteria your department uses to determine if a plan is good or not. If you don't know what objectives to try, that's at least always a good starting point. The RTOG, those trials that they do, those are always a really good starting point. They list explicitly what dose limits there are for their particular study. Grab a relevant study to what it is you're planning, plug those in as the optimization objectives. Start with something. But this is where if your GTV or CTV or PTV isn't meeting the criteria, then you come over here and you say, all right, so I wanted no more than 20% of the rectum to get 20 gray. I'm up to 57.7. So I'm going to add an objective and put in, I want no more, I want a max DDH. The dose level I want is 2000, 20%. How likely am I, just based on what you see, how likely am I to achieve this goal if this were real? If I got a good shot? Not very. Probably not. So if you know going into it, you don't have a great shot, but you just know you don't like this, here's a take-home point. Put in what you want, just assign it a really low weight. So let's add that and just see. I'm going to save this. What we should start to see is a change in the posterior part, right? The DVH point that I'm going for is right here. The green represents the rectum, so it's really going to try hard to push this rectal volume down to this dose level. But as you all know, in radiation oncology, there's no free lunch. No free lunch. So I got another 8 iterations, and then it stopped. So did I make the goal? No. What did I, not only did I not make the goal, what did I lose on top of it? PTV. Exactly. So now I could come back in here and I could say, no, my min dose, if it's not 80, I want this to be 200. And say, I'm going to force this to be 95. And it does it. Now when I scroll through, what do I notice? Here's the last thing and then we're done. So when I compare all that change, this is what we originally had. This is what we now have. Can anybody tell me what the cost of doing that particular step? We definitely reduced the dose to the rectum, and we similarly met the rest of the criteria. What did we lose in that? Anybody know? What was the cost of doing business? Integral dose probably didn't change a lot because the beams themselves, we kept the same number of fields. The dose fall off? No. This represents 110%. Let's turn on 105. Okay. Hotspot. If I undo this, 110 goes away. So what does that tell me? As with 3D, it's the same kind of issue. If your hotspot, if your higher than prescription dose volume is too high, you have most likely asked for something fairly unreasonable. If you can't figure out why it's so hot, go back through and look at your objectives. This is fine. This doesn't change that, so we should be good. This, well, it still doesn't violate. It doesn't set anything of a different max dose. It's attached to the prescription. That's fine. The distance, pretty tight, but we saw it before we added anything else, and it looked like it did okay. This is when things kind of went awry. So this is where we have to then, sometimes, guys, you pull in the doc, right? Sometimes you're gonna do this. I wouldn't show the doctor this personally, but that's me. Um, when you get to a point, though, you're going to get to a point where you have to show the doctor something. And when it's this kind of situation, that's their call. You've covered the volume, right? Let's go back to what somebody said before. Covered the volume. This is as low as we can get. What's the trade-off? The trade-off is the max dose. But just like somebody else said, maybe if it's in the CTV or the GTV, maybe it doesn't matter. Maybe it doesn't matter, but that's not our job. And I hate to say it that way, that's their role. They decide if that's okay. If they don't like the amount of the 105 covering most of their volume because they say, I only wrote for 4,500, not 50 gray or 47 gray, cool that down, done. We already know what we can do. Just get rid of this and re-optimize. That's what we had before. All right. I'm going to call it there. Any questions before I let you all run? That is phase 1 of IMRT. All right. Go out, keep doing what you're doing. Check for additional materials, probably Monday next week. Bowel, that's right. Penile bulb, bowel, it's all there. Thank you guys. Good job tonight. It is Doug Jones. Good call. Good call. Smartest man I maybe have ever met in my life. Miss him dearly. Yeah, he is deserving of it. Good night.